Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I'm the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this World Affairs Today and Author Series event. The 20th century was a century of international economic growth. It witnessed the exponential rise of Latin America, African, Asian, and Middle Eastern economies, while growth in the established economies continued as well. Each of these economies, however, also suffered various crises after their booms. At the turn of the 21st century, and to the present day, the world has seen an increase in the rate of economic turmoil. What has caused these rises in economic fortune, as well as their decline? Mark Weisbrot, author of Failed: What Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy, will explore where he believes conventional economic theory failed and what should be addressed instead. He is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and the president of the Just Foreign Policy. He has testified before U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, as well as the House of Representatives Committee about the economic crisis in Argentina. In addition to authoring his most current book, he is also the co-author of Social Security: The Phony Crisis, published in 2001. He appears regularly on national and local television and radio programs to discuss economic policy and writes regularly for Al Jazeera America. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to the World Affairs Council for organizing this. And thank you all for coming. I'll talk a little bit about the book. Of course, that's the purpose of this, and try to relate it to things that are still happening. I think that if you get some idea of what's happened in the past 20 or 30 years, you can't, of course, predict the future, but there are some projections, I think, that you can make that are a little different from what most of the experts, you notice the title is in quotes, because some of them are experts and some are not, but what most of them are saying. Why don't we start with Greece? Because that's part of a special problem that's called the Eurozone. And you can see we just had an election there on Sunday. And if you read some of the articles in the press, there were numerous comments by voters and non-voters alike. It was a record low turnout, saying that basically the future of our country was already decided before the first ballot was cast. And this, I think, is testimony to both the power of ideas and the power of a special arrangement, which is the Eurozone. In other words, the democracy that the country once had, control over its most important economic policies, is basically gone. And that's true for all of the vulnerable countries in the Eurozone. And of course, and one way you can see this is just look at Europe. And I do this in the book. I compare Europe to the United States. You know, this was the epicenter of the Great Depression, which was in the world financial crisis that began in 2008. Sorry, I need a little water, I think. And yet, Europe's unemployment, the Eurozone's unemployment, is twice the level of ours today. 7 years later. And you can, how did this happen? How is it that Europe ended up not only having a recession of similar length of ours when the crisis hit, but then 2 additional years and still a lot of trouble. And of course, Greece, 6 years of recession. And the European officials are now projecting that they will be in recession not only this year, but next year, and supposedly recover in 2017. And of course, their projections, the IMF projections, have been wrong almost every year since 2010. So it might go on longer than that. And to me, the most striking thing is that the voters of Greece, they returned the Syriza government to power, even though they had originally elected them just, 9 months ago, to change this, right? To get rid of the depression, to change policies, basically, to do what they needed to do for the economy to recover. And they came back. They did put up a fight, but they came back to the voters in this election, and they said, we can't do anything, basically, but you should vote for us anyway because we're going to do the best we can. And people did, and it's understandable that they did, given the knowledge that they had. In other words, when the leaders of all major political parties and almost all the media says something, it becomes a fact. And even if it's not a fact. And the fact in this case was there was no alternative but to capitulate to the demands of the European authorities, which, by now, most economists even would tell you don't really make any sense, even from an Econ 101 point of view. They're going to shrink the economy further. That's in the program, okay? They're going to engage in fiscal tightening. That's why they can already project at least another year of recession. It's actually caused by the policies that the government has signed on to. Now, one theme of this book is that there are always alternatives to that. There are always alternatives to prolonged failure and recession. At a particular moment, you can have a crisis and the alternatives can be restricted, but no country ever has to go through what Greece has gone through and even what the Eurozone has gone through. The Great Depression in the United States was not a result, as many people think, of just a one-time crash or one or two events. It was a whole series of bad choices that gave us a Great Depression. It's a whole series of bad choices that give you the Greek Depression. So what would be the alternative in Greece? The obvious alternative would be to say no to the European authorities and mean it. That is, leave. They didn't even have to leave the Eurozone because the finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, had the plan B, where they were going to basically issue a parallel currency. And if the Europeans wanted to kick them out, then they would kick them out. But they would be able to have the economy recover. Now, how do we know? Okay. Now, it is a problem, right? It's a special problem in the Eurozone because once they surrendered their control over these policies, they're also under this threat. And the European Central Bank actually did something that no central bank in history has ever done deliberately. Central banks have wrecked economies in the past, but never on purpose, okay? And they actually did that. And you could see it in the newspapers. It was right there. 8 or 9 days after Syriza was elected, they already started restricting their credit and pushing the economy further to recession. And then they cut it so much at the time of the July 5th referendum, the week before that, they cut it enough so that they actually forced a closure of the banking system. Now, all of this was in the news, of course, and everything I'm telling you is, in the news or it's part of official data. But it tends to get swept aside, and not completely. I mean, in the case of Greece, you do have Nobel Prize-winning economists, Paul Krugman, Joe Stiglitz, and again, probably the majority of the profession who thinks this is terribly wrong. But nonetheless, the idea comes across, and it came across to the Greek voters, obviously, that they really had no choice. And so one of the things I try to do is show, well, there are choices. Again, if they were there's life after financial crisis, okay? So if they were forced out of the euro, it's a difficult thing for a leader like Tsipras to do because right now, he can still, he got elected a second time by blaming the European authorities for the mess. And it's true, they did cause the mess. On the other hand, once he actually takes the country out of the Eurozone, then it's his mess, you see? So that creates a certain political dynamic that makes it very hard. And not only that, you're pretty sure that the mess gets worse temporarily before it gets better. So it's very difficult. So they have them in a way. But nonetheless, I think the misunderstanding of the situation is still very powerful, because people don't realize that they would recover, and they would recover a lot faster than than the experience they've had. Now, how do we know this? Well, we can look at any of the financial crises and recessions, especially associated with devaluations, of the last 20 years, and I put them in there, and there's no cases of the Asian financial crisis, the Brazilian crisis, the Russian crisis, and of course the Argentine crisis, which is the most comparable to this one. They only had 3 months. It was a very severe 3 months, but they had only had 3 months of recession or continued depression after they defaulted and devalued on their debt. Devalued their currency and defaulted on their debt in 3 months, and then they recovered, and they grew 63% over the next 6 years, 63% real inflation-adjusted GDP growth. And they were able to reduce, poverty by more than 2/3 during these years. And so this was obviously a success. Now, people come back and say, and I've had these discussions on television and on panels and everywhere else. Well, Argentina had a commodities boom, and this is what did it. Well, if you actually look at the data, that isn't what did it. Only 12% of the growth that they had during this period was actually attributable to exports at all, and a fraction of that was commodities. So it wasn't an export-driven boom. The main thing they did is what Greece and Spain and the other countries have to do if they really want to reduce mass unemployment, which is to free themselves from this foreign power that is making their most important economic decisions for them. And that is, of course, the European Central Bank, the IMF, the European Commission, and the Eurogroup of finance ministers. These are the bodies that are making these decisions and have decided to basically restructure and change the Greek economy and some other economies in the way they see fit. And that's the other point I think was really missed, even by the economists who have written very, very excellent material on this crisis, is that this isn't just, actually it's not at all them trying to squeeze debt out of Greece, because they could have settled this back in 2009, and the creditors wouldn't have lost a fraction of what they've lost now, as they've increased their debt burden and made it another restructuring inevitable. They could have settled this for very, very little debt relief. So why do they do this and torment these countries and give them mass unemployment for years? Spain still has 22% unemployment. These are human tragedies in these countries. And the Eurozone as a whole, as I said, has twice the unemployment of the United States by the same comparable measure, that is over 11%. So why do they have that, and why do they do it? And the answer is that they actually used the crisis to get what they wanted politically. It's not a conspiracy theory, actually. You can see it in their public statements occasionally, you had any number of Eurozone leaders, European officials, saying that we want to see these structural reforms before. There was, 2 years of crisis. That was 2011 and almost all of 2012. You had a financial crisis in Europe, which was not the same thing as the crisis caused by the austerity. This was a crisis of the euro. If you remember, there were doubts of whether the euro would survive. And they kept this. They pushed they being the European Central Bank and its Germany and its allies, they kept this crisis going, and they kept it for 2 years, added 2 years of recession, and it was completely unnecessary. And how do we know this is unnecessary? Because in July of 2012, Mario Draghi, who was the head of the central bank and still is, said basically 3 words. He said, "We will do whatever it takes to preserve the euro." And that was the end of the financial part of the European recession. Okay, you can look at a graph of the yields on 10-year bonds for Italy and Spain. Those were the countries that were too big to fail. Those were the ones that were creating doubt about the euro, because if those interest rates had stayed at the level that they were in 2011 and into 2012, then you would have had an unsustainable debt in Spain and Italy, just like Greece, only 5 times bigger in each country, or more than that, and you would have had the end of the euro. So all he had to do was say, we're going to do whatever it takes, because it wasn't the story that even a lot of the left thinks it was, that it was, the crisis was caused by the banks or the creditors trying to squeeze Greece. It was the European authorities not doing what a central bank normally does, which is to act as a lender of last resort and backstop these debts so that the interest rates would drop. And then they dropped. They went straight down from there. And they're still very low today in spite of the crisis in Greece. And why is that? Because people now know that the European Central Bank will make sure that these bonds are guaranteed. And therefore, you can, investors will buy them knowing that they are safe at very low interest rates. And that is all he had to do. He didn't even have to put up any money, as it turned out. That was enough. The hedge funds and everybody else got the message. And there was no more speculation against those bonds. So that's, I think, a very important lesson. Now, how else do we know that this is what was driving these additional 2 years of crisis? Another thing you can look at, and again, this is reviewed here, we looked at 67 Article 4 papers. These are papers that are written by the IMF with the country government. It's under Article 4 of the IMF Charter. Almost every government in the world does these. That's a member of the IMF. And so you had 67 of them for the 4 years, 2008 through 2011. And if you look at these papers, you can actually see the agenda. It was kind of an elite consensus. What were they trying to get these governments to do? And it's a very uniform agenda. It's reducing public sector employment, like Greece did, by 20%, cutting pensions, cutting healthcare spending, increasing labor supply, changing the law around collective bargaining, as you did in Spain and Greece. They're trying to do it still, to weaken labor, all things that push wages down overall and increase inequality. And again, it's not a conspiracy. You can read all these agreements, and you even have quotes in a couple of the agreements, which I put in the book, where they say things like economic crises are often the best time to get these measures implemented. And it's not surprising, because these are things that people in Greece and Spain and Portugal and Ireland and Italy would never vote for. Okay, so how do they get them to do it? They tell them, look, we're about to have an economic meltdown here, and you've got to make these changes. So that's very, very important. And that brings me to another, because if you don't understand that, which again, it hasn't been covered much in the press, then you really don't understand the recent economic history of what happened in Europe. And is still happening, of course, especially in Greece. but also in the other countries. And they want to do it, Varoufakis often points to France and says, they want to do it to France too. But France is a bigger and more powerful member of the Eurozone. So it's not going to happen in the same way there. Although you did see Hollande, for example, abandon a lot of the things that he ran on after he was elected, and that's part of this Eurozone structure. So again, this is a combination of power and ideology that often, and their interaction that often gets overlooked, but it really helps us understand it. And I think that if the people of the Eurozone, I'm not going to dismiss, I spent some time in Spain in the last couple of years, and you can see people are really attached to the euro, and especially in countries where you have had dictatorships for most of the post-war period, and in Spain a kind of an incomplete transition to democracy. You have, the euro is kind of a ticket to first-class citizenship of Europe. And there's a lot of confusion, just like if you ask people here, most people are confused between the euro and the Eurozone. They don't realize that it's, 19 out of 29 countries that have the euro, and the rest don't, that you can be in the European Union and not have the euro. A lot of people in the Eurozone don't realize, they think they're really going to leave Europe. And the German officials that were really threatening Greece before the July 5th referendum, they kind of played on this by telling people that, you're going to choose between being in Europe and not being in Europe. And there's a whole geopolitical aspect of this too, which I won't have time for right now, but that's part of the struggle as well. The idea of Europe being tied to the United States, and where is it going to go? And there were a lot of noise about, Greece would end up with Russia. And so that kind of thing is part of it too. I don't want to negate the political aspect of it. It is, there is a very strong attachment, but I think that if people knew that the price that they were paying, mass unemployment all the way through, the IMF projections 2018, 2019, to have this terrible whole generation, suffer like this. And they kind of know that. But if they knew that they wouldn't have this if they left the euro, that was pretty much guaranteed, I think you would get a majority of people wanting to leave. Not everybody. You would still have people who, don't care about the rest of the unemployed and secure. They're either rich or their job is secure, and they just want to have the currency because they want to be, cosmopolitan or whatever. But if people knew that what the alternatives really were, you wouldn't have this. Although, again, the structure of the Eurozone has made it extremely tough. And this is another thing, because the whole the history that I just described should have provoked a discussion about democracy and national sovereignty, right? And how careful any country should be before giving up its national control over its most important economic policies, monetary, exchange rate, and then ultimately for the Eurozone countries, fiscal policy as well. This should have been a really big deal, because this is what happens. They gave up this power, and they gave it to people with, unfortunately, an extremist worldview. I mean, the Germans and the European Central Bank, really had an extreme view on monetary policy, something that makes, Bernanke in the United States look like a socialist. And so that, that should have been a discussion. And that, I think, has to be a discussion going forward always. When we look at the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, all of these institutions, the theory, of course, is that you give up some of your autonomy and your national sovereignty, and you get something in return. But you got to look at that trade-off very carefully. And it also goes to this question of how are these things going to change? Are they going to change because these institutions will change? Or are they going to change because these institutions become weaker and national sovereignty reasserts itself? And I think it's the second thing that's going to happen. That unfortunately, I mean, we're going to have international cooperation, hopefully, on climate change, on migration, on things where there's a kind of a common human belief. It's not completely common. We have, Republicans controlling our Congress right now, but on climate change. But the point is, on these issues, you don't have the multilateral institutions on the wrong side of the majority of humanity, okay? Like you do with the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. You don't have, these are institutions that are really set up under these neoliberal principles that are built into them. And until you change the governments that are represented there, you're not going to change the institutions very much. We had this debate here in Washington, we've had it for like 15 or 20 years, even before the Eurozone. And people said, no, we're, back in the Asian financial crisis, we're going to change the IMF. And you can see how much they've changed in the last 15, 20 years. Very little, okay? Very, very little. In the world financial crisis and recession, again, we looked at 31 countries that had IMF agreements, not Article 4s, but actual loan agreements where the IMF told them what to do. And in 41. And in 31 out of the 41 agreements, they required what economists call pro-cyclical fiscal and or monetary policies. That is, tightening fiscal or monetary policy while the economy was slowing or in recession. Okay, so that's still there. And now the big difference today is that most of the IMF loans are in Europe instead of in developing countries, but they're doing the same thing. The only thing you can say for them is that, at least in that case, it's not really them making the decisions. It's the European directors that are making the decisions for them instead of the U.S. Treasury Department, which makes most of the decisions for developing countries. So again, that's very important. And that is, I have a whole chapter on the IMF in this book, because this is another thing that everybody in Washington knows, but very few people have talked about over the past 30 years. And that is, the IMF, until the turn of this century, was the most important avenue of influence for the United States in developing countries, even more than the military and the 17 intelligence agencies we now have, and everything else, because that was they were kind of the head of a creditors cartel, where if you didn't get an IMF agreement, if you were a country that needed any kind of balance of payment support, and you didn't sign the IMF agreement, you didn't get money from the World Bank, which was much larger in its lending. You didn't get it from the regional banks like the Inter-American Development Bank, and you didn't get it from, often the private sector. And so this was a lot of power. This was concentrated power. You imagine when the IMF went to Argentina in their depression of 1998 and to 2002, and they said, this is what you're going to have to do. They had a lot of power until they finally defaulted and said goodbye to the IMF and paid them off a few years later. They get rid of them entirely. And then Brazil did a similar thing. They paid them off to get rid of them entirely. And then in Bolivia, you had country was under IMF agreements for, I think, 19 years consecutively, with one year absent. And of course, 28 years later, when Evo Morales was elected in 2005, they had a per capita income lower than they had 28 years earlier, and they couldn't nationalize their hydrocarbons industry, which was extremely important, until they got rid of the IMF, which they did. So what happened in terms of going back, to our debate here in Washington, 20 years ago, what happened was it was really what I was arguing back then, not that the IMF should be abolished, but that the change is going to take place mostly not from changes in IMF policy, but from the IMF losing its influence over governments. And that is what happened. Again, hardly anybody has even written about this, which is really striking because it was a huge change. It's the biggest change, I think, in the international financial system since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 73. What happened was middle-income countries mostly now do not borrow from the IMF at all, and they are not subject, therefore, to their conditions. And in this chapter, I tell the story of how that happened. And, it began with the Asian crisis, where the IMF made things a lot worse in 1977 to 99. And then you had, of course, the Argentine default, where they didn't default to the IMF, but they defied them. And they actually did. They defaulted to the IMF temporarily in September of 2003, and then the IMF backed down and said, no, it's not a default. They rolled over their debt, and that was it. And that kind of showed, that was kind of the end of an era for the IMF. It didn't have this power that it had for decades to exert an enormous influence over, again, any developing country that was unfortunate enough to have to borrow for balance of payments purposes. And not only from them, but from other members of the creditors cartel. So if you were borrowing from the World Bank before this century, you also would end up with IMF conditions often as well. So that's a huge historical change. And I think it's very important because I think it contributed to some of the rebound that you saw in economic growth and some of the social gains as well in the 21st century, which you really did see. And Latin America, of course, is a key example of that. They had no improvement in poverty from 1980 to 2000. In fact, they had a miserable economic failure from 1980 to 2000. The entire growth, GDP growth per capita, per person, the most basic measure that economists have of economic progress, for those 20 years was only 5.7%. Not annually, but for the entire 20 years. Now you compare that to the prior 20 years when these governments were doing all the things that now are considered wrong, like industrial and development policy and state-led development and things like that. The per capita income grew by 91%, okay? So you had this huge economic failure in Latin America from the 60 to 80 period to 80 to 2000. And then you had, in the 21st century, a rebound. And it was it made quite a difference. Just to give you one figure, from 2003 or you could take 2000 to 2013 if you want, you had a reduction in poverty in Latin America from 44 to 28%. Okay? Again, it increased in the prior 20 years. That was a result mostly of the increased growth that these countries had, and also specific programs that various countries implemented in Brazil, especially in the ones that elected left governments. And by the way, that was another big geopolitical change, which the press here has only really noticed in the last year or so, but it's been going on for a while. You had, I don't say they don't report on the elections. Of course, they report on the elections. But, it's really only in the last year that the major press and the publications that write about foreign policy have come to accept that there's been a permanent change in this hemisphere, that this is the left that now governs, the majority of Latin America, and they've been elected and reelected since 1998. in Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, now Uruguay, Chile, Paraguay, El Salvador, Nicaragua. And so they have transformed hemispheric relations. And this is a major geopolitical change. First, as I mentioned, because they were able to do implement some economic policies that they weren't able to do in the past. And I go through in the last chapter 5, I look at some of these changes in Latin America, and also some of the challenges that they faced in the last couple of years, because the Latin American economy has slowed. This year it's only going to grow by 0.5%, and you have some serious crises and recessions. In Brazil, you have a recession, but in Venezuela, you have a recession as well as very high inflation. In all the countries, you have a slowdown, but you haven't lost anywhere near the gains that they've made in the last decade, okay? And so that's a very important thing, and I can talk about that more if people want to know, well, are they going to have another miserable period like they had from 1980 to 2000, for example? And I would argue no, because now they have independent governments. In that period, they didn't really have that. They were more like Greece, okay, where they didn't really have control over their most important economic policies. And in the 1980s especially, the creditors were actually draining, 6 or 7% of GDP annually out of these countries for several years in debt repayments. It was a lot worse than Greece, okay? And so they couldn't grow. And so this is a real big, important change. The getting rid of the IMF is just one part of it, but the independence and the leftward shift, I think, are a big part of it, and it's going to be a permanent change. In the book, I go through some of the policies that they had. Brazil, for example, they doubled the minimum wage in real terms under the Workers' Party. That was a huge thing. They increased the Bolsa Familia anti-poverty program, conditional cash transfer. That was a smaller program, but it still had a large impact. If you look at the number of people that were pulled across the poverty line by that program, they reduced unemployment to a record low, 4.9% a couple of years ago. That increased workers' bargaining power. So for the first time, you had real wage increases, quite significant, 35% wage increases. And you had some redistribution of income if you look at the distribution by quintile. All of these things combined to redistribute income and to reduce poverty. And you had similar programs in other countries. They were different, of course, different emphasis. Bolivia doubles its public investment. That helped a lot. They increased pension coverage. They had land reform, a huge land reform, actually. 5 million hectares were redistributed. And again, all of these are official data, and they're not contested by anyone. And they're just not, including the World Bank. And they're just not really reported all that much, or not as much as, when these countries run into trouble. That's, a lot bigger news in the press. And of course, for countries like Venezuela, for the whole 15 years, it was just bad news every day, even when the economy was booming and income, GDP doubled between 2003 and 2008. You had nothing but, horrible news in the press overwhelmingly. So that's the extreme case. But all of these countries, I think, are treated fairly badly in the news, not only on the economics, but even more on their politics. And then this is what you would expect, especially here in Washington. Countries that go against the United States are going to get really bad press. The last thing that I mention here, because it's related to these neoliberal policy changes, is the growth failure that I described in Latin America for the last 2 decades of the 20th century. That was pretty much worldwide in developing countries. So again, you had the big exception, China. But if you look at the individual countries, which I think is the appropriate unit, because policy is made at the level of the individual government. So even though China is a huge part of the developing world, and so is India, okay, they're just 2 countries. So if you look at all the countries where this experiment was made, which is almost all the countries in the world, right? You had these changes. You had independent central banks, for example, which meant not necessarily independent in the sense that a Supreme Court is independent, but independent in the sense they were independent of the public, but they were making economic decisions that were very heavily influenced by banks, you know, as in the United States and in Europe has been like this for a long time. And so you had independent central banks, you had tighter fiscal and monetary policies, which I describe very often during recessions and when economies were slowing. You had the abandonment of these development policies, industrial policies that were essential to the development that you saw, what I described between 1960 and 1980. You had a whole restriction of choices, and this is, I think, a big thing, because choices are generally a good thing. You know, economic theory says that that's good for consumers to have more choices. Unfortunately, most economists don't defend that principle when it comes to governments. They think that governments should only do certain things. And if it takes a lot of threats and pressure to make them do it, that's usually okay with them. But in fact, they had more choices during the 1960 to 1980 period, because that was the period where the United States, partly because of the Cold War, the U.S. was competing with the Soviet Union, and they had to look at this from a geostrategic standpoint. And so there were a variety of reasons, but I think that was a big part of it. And then, of course, from 80 to 2000, the U.S. was more powerful during most of this period, and these institutions were able to impose and change policies from these development policies that had produced a lot of growth and development to policies that did not. And so what I show in the book is that this was a worldwide phenomenon. If you look at the vast majority of low and middle income countries, you see an economic failure. That's part of the title of the book. A long-term economic failure, the kind of thing that really never has to happen in most of the low and middle income countries. And then you see finally a rebound in the 21st century to prior rates of growth. Not in Latin America, they didn't rebound to the levels that they had in the 60s and 70s. But in overall, if you look at the countries as a whole, you did see a rebound, and a lot of it was China. And to me, that is the great irony, and I'll end with that. You had this one country, the biggest country by population in the world, that didn't follow the neoliberal policies at all. They had their own development policy, a state-led development policy where they still run the banks. They controlled most of investment. It was led by state-owned enterprises. And even when they began to liberalize, they did it very slowly, not like they did in the other countries. No shock therapy like you had in the former Soviet Union. They did it very, very slowly and carefully to make sure that they could control the development and control most of investment. And they, of course, became the fastest growing economy in world history. And they pulled up a lot of other countries. And now, of course, the question is, you know, how much they're going to be able to do in the future. But that, to me, is the great irony. The one country that really most abandoned and stayed away from the neoliberal experiment that most countries in the world went through became not only the world's largest economy, but the one that was most responsible for the progress that we did have in low and middle income countries in the 21st century. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Returning to the crisis in Greece, from where I'm sitting, most of the people running the troika seem to be neoclassically trained economists. So my question is this. Would you say that there's a fundamental conflict between economics, especially as taught at the overwhelming majority of US universities today, and democracy, as most people envision democracy?
Well, there is some of that. I wouldn't want to take it too far because, the basic Econ 101 that you learn, and especially the national income accounting, will tell you, and Paul Krugman makes a point out of this, at least once every month or so, that what happened in the Eurozone is pretty much exactly what the textbook models Keynesian models would predict. So at that level, if you tighten fiscal policy in a recession, it's going to get worse. And so in that sense, a lot of the basic economics is true. But on the other hand, your other point, yeah, it's a problem because if you look at a lot of other economic questions, like the question of development that I described, there the profession is much worse. And I don't want to, even on the macro question, well, the independent central bank, for example, the idea that central bank, should make these decisions without any supervision from elected bodies or even the rest of the executive, and they end up listening to banks. That's supported by the majority of the economics profession. So the majority of economics profession does support a fair amount of bad policies. And a lot of those are taught. But on the other hand, it's not everything. Okay. There are a lot of things that are basic economics that are ignored and gone against for political reasons. And the Eurozone is a classic example, and also what a lot of the IMF macro policy in developing countries as well.
Much of the discussion here dealt with Greece, which is about the size of South Carolina in terms of economic growth, or recent gains in Latin America, which were reversed by the collapse in commodity prices. Brazil, for example. I think the most compelling question is what is the future for the world economy? How do you see what is the scenario, the most likely scenario? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, Greece is obviously it's only 2% of the Eurozone GDP. So I talked about that mainly to illustrate the ideas. But I think the Eurozone the European Union, of course, is the largest economy in the world. It's bigger than the United States. And the Eurozone is quite large as well. And that does determine, that's been, I would say, since the Great Recession, that's been the biggest drag on the world economy of any economy in the world. So it is very important what happens in the Eurozone. And it's hard to predict what will happen there. There will be some recovery. And the question is, but there's going to be more crises ahead too. So a lot will depend on what they do. The U.S. economy, of course, is the largest economy by, exchange rate measurement. And a lot's going to be dependent on what we do here as well. The U.S. economy is recovering, but again, you have the Federal Reserve, central bank, was even considering the fact that they were even considering raising interest rates. If they decide, when they decide to do that, if it's a succession of interest rate increases especially, or if it looks like that's coming, that can cause enormous damage, not just to the U.S. economy, but to developing countries. We've seen that before. That was part of the crisis in the late 90s, right, when the Fed began to raise interest rate and pulled capital out of developing and middle-income countries. So, I'm not giving you a really good prediction because now we also have China. China used to be the one they plowed right through the world. First, the Asian financial crisis and the world recession. Even though they lost 3% of GDP in their exports, they still plowed right through it and contributed enormously to world economic growth during the recession, the world recession of 2009. Now there are doubts about China as well. So it is going to depend on a lot of policy decisions going forward. You want my guess? I think it's going to do a lot better than people think right now, yeah. I think China will change their policy to make sure that they have, rapid growth. I think the Eurozone is going to still be a drag and will go through crises, but ultimately that's going to be the weakest part, I think. And I think the U.S. Too will probably do well enough to have, not necessarily the kind of growth we had in the peak years of the 2000s, but something a lot better than we're looking at now. Yeah.
Are you concerned about the deflationary spiral in commodity prices, which usually precede a global recession?
I don't think that. Global recession is definitely possible. I don't take the deflation itself as the serious threat. The serious threat is the policies in the Eurozone, to a lesser extent in China and in other countries as well, that are not really counter-cyclical the way they were coming out of the world recession when we had a very fast rebound. That's what we needed. And that's what we're always going to need when the economy is weak and there's mass unemployment. I think that's a basic principle.
You've presented a picture of like two different outlooks, one of development and one of neoliberalism. And you've sort of indicated how they've moved at different decades. But I think part of the question is this all coming to more of a general conflict, And so you mentioned the BRICS a moment ago.
Well, there's conflict every day. I mean, there's conflict in the World Trade Organization. There's been conflict for since since it was started actually, but especially since '99, 2000, they've gotten very little done because the organization was set up by the rich countries with rules that benefited them. And even though it was a consensus process, unlike the IMF and the World Bank, where the rich countries controlled the majority of the votes, it still ended up being a place where the developing countries got screwed, And it would never pass the parliaments of countries. The world has changed. So I guess I would say, there is going to be continuing conflict over all of these things, conflict over the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, or the Trade and International Services Agreement. Again, all of these things are places where now that the developing world is bigger than it was 20 years ago, and there is more national sovereignty, they're going to fight more for their interest. And of course, you're thinking of flames from the sky, water running uphill in a final battle against all evil.
Not necessarily,
but
a ripening.
I don't think that. I don't think you're going to have necessarily. I hope we don't have a military conflict. I don't see that coming really. I think you could have an arms race. I hope for our sake in the United States we don't have an arms race with China because, we had an arms race with the Soviet Union. It was pretty costly, and they were about a quarter the size of us, and China's bigger than us now on a purchasing power parity basis. So if we have an arms race with them, you can say goodbye to your, Social Security and Medicare and anything else that the government is spending money on. So I think, I don't think you'll have that, but I think that the world is going to become more multipolar, and the United States is going to be a little bit less of an empire, I think. And I think that's a positive thing. And this is the hardest thing to get across here in Washington. You know, I mentioned this a little bit in the conclusion, but people think that they identify the United States and Europe with democracy, and they think if the United States and its allies are more powerful, you have more democracy in the world. And that's not really true, as you can see in the Eurozone, you know. But also you can see in Latin America, they had much more democracy when they were able to make their own economic decisions. And I think they have more democracy as the world becomes more multipolar. And, you know, this, I guess a lot of people don't grasp it because obviously, you know, the United States has a more democratic political structure than China. And, you know, and so does Europe. And they profess at least to support human rights, even though on a global scale they're, you know, bombing all these countries and assassinating people with drone strikes and things like that. But nonetheless, there are these principles, and so people think that, you know, this is going to be this is a more democratic world than you're going to have, say, when China and India and other developing countries are more powerful. And I think that's wrong, okay? The way we have to look at it is that internationally, the world becomes more democratic when more countries are able to pursue their own national destiny and their own national interests and development. And then within those countries, yeah, I think there's going to be a correlation between growth and development and democracy within that. But anyway, I think that is the future. The world's becoming more multipolar, and you will see it. I think it's happening very rapidly, actually. I could give other examples, you know, just from the news this week. You know, you can see Obama is going to talk to Putin now. You know, Putin never wanted this fight, you know. He could have talked to him at any time. Why is he doing that? Because they're recognizing that the policy of trying to just use threats and military force has failed terribly and has created this enormous mess in the Middle East, you know. And so you have a whole part of the national security state that kind of sees their limitations now. And a lot of it is, ironically, is being held back by politics and the media and the ideology of American exceptionalism and supremacy.
In regards to China, do you think that their establishment of a development bank independent of all these institutions such as IMF, World Bank, and U.S. Treasury could offer us hope, in your opinion?
Oh yeah, I think that's a great development, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And that came out right after this, I think. No, actually, I think it's in the preface by Ha-Joon Chang. I think he might have mentioned it. I had mentioned the BRICS Bank because that was right before this. And yeah, those are going to be very important. Those are part of the story I was telling about the IMF and the multilateral institutions. This is the first real alternative to those that has a kind of a more of a pro-development agenda. Now, they're not, they got a lot of problems with these as well. I'm not giving them an unqualified recommendation. I'm just saying that, yeah, that's going to be an important, these are going to be important institutions, partly because they're going to provide alternatives to the Bretton Woods institutions. And China has done that even outside of that, right? The hundreds of billions of dollars of loans, foreign aid, and foreign direct investment, which are not always easily distinguishable because there's not always enough transparency to see which is what. But nonetheless, just providing those alternative resources are going to be huge because, look, until now, the resources from the IMF and the bank, they've had conditions attached to them, and they are conditions that, in general, don't allow countries to reach their full potential. At the very least, you can say whatever you think about the Chinese lending or their motives or anything else. They're not telling these governments what their macroeconomic policy or their development policy or any other of their economic policies have to do. They have a strict principle on that, and so far they've stuck to that.
Thank you.
Thank you.